The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Fort Benton, Montana, and Ethan Novak didn't flinch as he watched another man crumple to the ground, the third challenger this month who thought they could take him down. It was 1878, and the frontier town had learned to fear his name, to step aside when his shadow fell across their doorways, to avert their eyes when he walked past with his hand resting on the pearl handle of his revolver. Blood had become as familiar to him as breathing, and mercy was a word he'd carved out of his vocabulary years ago when his brother had been gunned down by claim jumpers who never faced justice. The marshal had done nothing. The law had turned its back, and Ethan had learned that in this wild country, you either became the predator or you became prey. He holstered his weapon and turned away from the growing crowd, his boots kicking up dust as he headed toward the saloon where he'd been staying for the past week. The whispers followed him like ghosts, but he didn't care what these people thought. He'd come to Fort Benton tracking a gang that had robbed a freight wagon carrying gold, and he wouldn't leave until he'd collected every bounty on their heads. Money was the only thing that mattered now, the only thing that filled the hollow space where his conscience used to live. The summer heat beat down mercilessly on the Montana landscape, turning the air thick and oppressive. Ethan pushed through the saloon doors and ordered whiskey, downing it in one burning gulp. The bartender refilled his glass without being asked, his hands shaking slightly. Everyone in this town knew what Ethan was capable of, had heard the stories that followed him from Texas to Wyoming and now here. They called him ruthless, cold-blooded, a killer without remorse. They weren't wrong. He was planning his next move, studying the map he'd laid out on the bar when the doors burst open and a young woman stumbled inside. Her dress was torn and dirty, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, but it was the blood that caught everyone's attention. It streamed down her arm, dripping onto the wooden floor, leaving a crimson trail behind her. She took 2 more steps before her knees buckled, and she collapsed. Ethan was off his stool before he could think, his body moving on instinct that surprised him. He caught her before she hit the ground, and the moment his hands touched her, something inside his chest cracked open. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, and her green eyes fluttered open to meet his. She looked terrified not of him, but of whatever she'd run from. Blood soaked through her sleeve, and he could see the jagged wound beneath the fabric where something or someone had sliced her arm open from elbow to wrist. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please." That single word, spoken with such desperate trust, shattered something in him. His hands, which had dealt death so many times, suddenly felt too rough, too dangerous to be touching someone so fragile. He lifted her carefully, cradling her against his chest as if she were made of glass, and for the first time in 5 years, Ethan Novak felt fear. Not for himself, but for this bleeding woman in his arms. "Get the doctor," he barked at the bartender, his voice rougher than he intended. "Now." He carried her upstairs to his room, kicking the door open and laying her gently on the bed. Her blood stained his shirt, but he didn't care. He grabbed a clean cloth and pressed it against her wound, trying to slow the bleeding. She gasped in pain, and he found himself murmuring words of comfort, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Stay with me," he said softly, brushing her hair back from her face. "You're going to be all right. I've got you." Her eyes focused on his face, and he saw recognition there, followed by confusion. She'd heard of him, he realized. Everyone in Montana territory had heard of Ethan Novak, but she didn't pull away. Instead, her uninjured hand reached up and gripped his arm, holding on as if he were her anchor in a storm. "They tried to kill me," she managed to say. "The Thompson gang. They found out I saw them rob the freight office last week." I was delivering eggs from my family's farm when they rode past, and they recognized me today. They chased me into town, shot at me. I thought I was going to die." Ethan's jaw clenched. The Thompson gang was exactly who he'd been hunting. They were dangerous men, killers who wouldn't think twice about murdering a witness. The fact that this woman had made it to the saloon alive was a miracle. The fact that she'd stumbled into his protection was fate. "What's your name?" he asked, maintaining pressure on her wound even as his mind raced with plans. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Preston." "Sarah," he repeated, and the name felt important on his tongue like a prayer or a promise. "I'm Ethan, and I swear to you those men won't touch you again." The doctor arrived, a gruff older man named Henderson who'd seen his share of frontier violence. He examined Sarah's arm, cleaned the wound and stitched it carefully while Ethan stood by, unable to leave her side. Every time she winced in pain, he felt it like a knife to his own gut. When Henderson finally finished and wrapped her arm in clean bandages, Ethan released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "She'll need rest and care," Henderson said, wiping his hands. "That wound was deep. Another inch and it would have hit the artery. She's lucky to be alive." After the doctor left, Ethan pulled a chair beside the bed and sat down. Sarah had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her face still too pale but her breathing steady. He watched her, this woman who had somehow reached past all his carefully constructed walls in a single moment. The gentleness he'd felt when he saw her bleeding when he'd caught her falling, it hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, wrapping around his heart like vines reclaiming an abandoned building. He'd thought that part of him was dead, killed along with his brother, buried beneath years of violence and vengeance. But Sarah's trust, the way she'd looked at him not with fear but with hope, had awakened something he thought he'd lost forever. The capacity to care. The desire to protect not for money or revenge, but simply because someone needed protecting. Hours passed. The sun set, painting the room in shades of orange and red. Ethan didn't move from his post. When Sarah finally stirred, her eyes opening slowly, the first thing she saw was him, and she didn't look afraid. Instead, a small, tentative smile crossed her lips. "You stayed," she said softly. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. "Tell me about your family, about your farm." Sarah shifted carefully, propping herself up on her good arm. "My parents have a farm about 5 miles outside town. We raise chickens and sell eggs, some vegetables. It's not much, but it's honest work. I come to town twice a week to make deliveries." She looked down at her bandaged arm. "I never thought seeing something I shouldn't would almost cost me my life." "You're safe now," Ethan said firmly. "The Thompson gang won't get near you. I'll make sure of it." She studied his face in the lamplight, her green eyes searching. "Everyone says you're dangerous, that you've killed more men than anyone can count, that you don't care about anything except money and revenge." "They're right," he admitted, not flinching from the truth. "Or they were. I don't know what I am anymore." "You saved me," Sarah said simply. "When you could have walked away, when anyone else would have. You didn't even know me." "I couldn't," he said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't know how to express. "The moment I saw you bleeding, falling, something in me just broke open, or maybe it wasn't breaking, maybe it was healing. I don't know how to explain it." Sarah reached out with her good hand and placed it over his. Her skin was warm, her touch gentle, and Ethan felt that touch all the way through his body. "Maybe you don't have to explain it," she said softly. "Maybe you just have to let it happen." They talked through the night, their conversation flowing easily despite the strangeness of their circumstances. Sarah told him about growing up on the frontier, about losing her older brother to a fever when she was 15, about her dreams of someday having a larger farm. maybe raising horses. Ethan found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, about his own brother's death, about the rage that had consumed him, about the emptiness he'd been trying to fill with violence and bounties. "You're not that man anymore," Sarah said when he finished. "I can see it in your eyes. The man who held me so carefully, who stayed by my side all night, that's who you really are." "I want to believe that," Ethan admitted. "But I've done terrible things, Sarah. I've killed men who probably deserved it, but I did it without mercy, without hesitation." "Then don't hesitate now," she said, squeezing his hand. "Choose to be different. Choose to be better." Her words settled into his chest like seeds in fertile soil. As dawn broke over Fort Benton, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Ethan made a decision. He would deal with the Thompson gang not as the ruthless killer he'd been, but as the man he wanted to become. He would bring them to justice, but he would do it the right way, for Sarah, for himself, for the future he suddenly, desperately wanted. But first, he needed to keep Sarah safe. He couldn't risk the gang finding out where she was. When she was strong enough to sit up and eat the breakfast he'd brought from the kitchen downstairs, he laid out his plan. "I'm going to take you to the marshal," he said. "You'll give a statement about what you saw. Then I'm going to ride out and find the Thompson gang." "No," Sarah said immediately, her eyes wide. "They'll kill you. There are 5 of them, Ethan, 5 against 1. I've faced worse odds," he said, trying to sound confident. The truth was, he didn't care about the odds. He cared about making sure Sarah was safe, that the men who'd hurt her faced justice. "Then let me come with you to the marshal at least," she insisted. "I won't hide while you fight my battles." They argued about it, but Sarah was stubborn, and Ethan found he couldn't refuse her. Together, they made their way to the marshal's office, Ethan keeping a protective hand on Sarah's back, his eyes scanning every shadow and doorway. The town was waking up, and people stopped to stare at the sight of the ruthless bounty hunter walking beside the injured farm girl with such obvious care. Marshal Garrett was a weathered man in his 50s who listened carefully to Sarah's statement. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied Ethan. "I heard you were in town hunting the Thompson gang. Looks like they've given us both reason to want them behind bars now." "I'm riding out today," Ethan said flatly. "I'll bring them in." "Dead or alive?" Garrett said, not making it a question. "Alive," Ethan surprised himself by saying. Sarah's hand found his and he squeezed it gently. "Alive, so they can stand trial for what they've done." The marshal raised his eyebrows but nodded. "I'll deputize you if you want the authority." Ethan accepted the badge, pinning it to his vest. It felt strange, this symbol of law and order on a man who'd lived outside both for so long. But when Sarah smiled at him, proud and relieved, he knew he'd made the right choice. He took Sarah back to the saloon, despite her protests that she should return to her family's farm. "Not until the gang is caught," he said firmly. "You stay here, where there are people around, where the marshal can check on you. I need to know you're safe, Sarah. I can't ride out there if I'm worried about you." She touched his face, her palm resting against his rough jaw. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Please come back." Ethan covered her hand with his, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. The gesture was tender, intimate, and it felt like a promise. "I will," he said. "I swear it." He rode out within the hour, following leads and information he'd gathered over the past week. The Thompson gang had a hideout in the hills north of Fort Benton, an old trapper's cabin that offered a good view of the surrounding area. Ethan approached carefully, using every skill he'd learned over years of hunting men. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't driven by cold rage or the hunger for bounty money. He was driven by the memory of Sarah's blood on his hands, by the trust in her eyes, by the gentleness she'd awakened in him. He found them as the sun reached its peak, the 5 men lounging around the cabin, passing a bottle between them. Ethan could have shot them all from his position in the rocks above. 5 bullets, 5 bodies, job done the way he would have done it a week ago. Instead, he waited until 2 of them went inside, then made his move. "Frank Thompson," he called out, stepping into view with his rifle raised. "You and your boys are under arrest for robbery and attempted murder. You can come peaceful or you can come bleeding. Your choice." The 3 men outside went for their guns, but Ethan was faster. He shot the weapons from their hands with 3 precise shots, the kind of marksmanship that had made his reputation. They howled in pain, clutching their injured hands, and the 2 men inside came running out. Ethan had them covered before they could raise their weapons. "Next shots go through flesh instead of iron," he warned. "Drop your guns and get on the ground." Something in his voice, some cold certainty, made them comply. These were hard men, killers, but they recognized someone more dangerous when they saw him. Ethan tied them up efficiently, loading them onto their own horses. The ride back to Fort Benton took hours, and the whole way his prisoners cursed and threatened him. But Ethan's mind was elsewhere, focused on getting back to Sarah, on seeing her safe and healing. When he rode into town with 5 bound men in tow, people came out to watch. The marshal met him in the street, nodding approval as he took custody of the prisoners. "Clean work, Novak. No bodies." "I gave my word," Ethan said simply, dismounting. He didn't wait for the marshal's response, didn't stay to accept the praise or collect the bounty. He headed straight for the saloon, taking the stairs 2 at a time to his room. Sarah was sitting by the window, her bandaged arm resting in her lap, and when she saw him, her face lit up with such joy that Ethan felt his heart stagger in his chest. She stood carefully, and he crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms as gently as he could, mindful of her injury. "You came back," she breathed against his chest. "I'll always come back to you," he said, the words coming from somewhere deep and true inside him. "Always, Sarah." She pulled back enough to look up at him, her green eyes shining with tears. "I was so scared. I tried not to be, but I kept thinking about what could happen to you, and I realized something. I realized that in one day you've become more important to me than anyone I've ever known." "Sarah," he said her name like a revelation, like the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. "I don't know how this happened. I don't understand how you walked into that saloon bleeding and changed everything I am in a single moment. But you did. You made me want to be better. You made me remember how to be gentle, how to care about something other than revenge and blood money." "Then don't go back to that life," she said urgently. "Stay here. Stay with me. Build something new." Ethan cupped her face in his hands, these hands that had dealt so much death, now trembling with the desire to create life instead. "I want that," he admitted. "More than I've wanted anything. But I don't know how to be anything other than what I am." "You're more than a bounty hunter," Sarah insisted. "You're kind and brave and protective. You could be anything you want, Ethan. A rancher, a deputy, a farmer even. It doesn't matter what you do. What matters is who you are when you're doing it." He kissed her then, unable to hold back any longer. It was gentle at first, tender and questioning, but when she pressed closer, her good arm wrapping around his neck, it deepened into something more. It was a kiss full of promise and possibility, a kiss that tasted like second chances and new beginnings. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said, the words rough and unpracticed but absolutely sincere. "I don't know how I can love someone I just met, but I do. I love you, Sarah Preston, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving I deserve you." "You already deserve me," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. And I love you too, Ethan Novak. I loved you from the moment you caught me falling, from the moment I saw the fear in your eyes when you thought I might die. That's when I knew you weren't the man everyone said you were. Or maybe you were, but you didn't want to be anymore. They spent the evening making plans, dreaming out loud about the future they wanted to build together. Ethan went to see Sarah's parents the next day, riding out to their farm with his heart pounding harder than it ever had facing down armed criminals. George and Martha Preston were wary at first, having heard the stories about him. But when they saw how he looked at their daughter, how careful he was with her injured arm, how he spoke to her with such obvious love and respect, they softened. "I know my reputation," Ethan said honestly, sitting in their modest farmhouse. "I know I'm not the kind of man you'd choose for Sarah, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove I can be. She's changed me. She's made me want to be the man I should have been all along." George Preston studied him for a long moment, then looked at his daughter. "What do you want, Sarah girl?" "I want him, Papa," Sarah said simply, taking Ethan's hand. "I want the life we can build together." Martha wiped tears from her eyes and nodded. "Then you have our blessing." "But Ethan Novak, if you hurt our daughter, there won't be a place in this territory you can hide." "I won't," Ethan promised. "I'd rather die than cause her pain." The next few weeks passed in a blur of healing and planning. Sarah's arm recovered well under the doctor's care, and Ethan spent his days helping on the Preston farm, learning the rhythms of planting and tending and harvesting. It was hard work, honest work, and he found satisfaction in it that bounty hunting had never given him. He sold his guns except for one rifle for hunting and protection, and he took the money he'd saved from years of bounties and bought land adjacent to the Preston farm. On a warm September evening, with the Montana sky painted in brilliant sunset colors, Ethan and Sarah were married in a simple ceremony at the small church in Fort Benton. The whole town came, curious to see the ruthless bounty hunter marry the farm girl who tamed him. Ethan wore new clothes, his hair trimmed neat, and when Sarah walked down the aisle in a simple white dress her mother had made, he felt tears sting his eyes. "You're beautiful," he whispered when she reached his side. "You're crying," she said softly, reaching up to wipe a tear from his cheek. "Happy tears," he said, catching her hand and kissing it. "The happiest I've ever been." They spoke their vows with the sunset streaming through the church windows, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ethan kissed Sarah with all the gentleness and passion he felt, and the congregation applauded. It was a new beginning for both of them, a chance to create something beautiful from the ashes of who they'd been. They built a house on Ethan's land, working alongside Sarah's father and brothers. It was a good house, sturdy and warm, with a bedroom upstairs that had windows facing east so they could watch the sunrise. Ethan proved to have a talent for carpentry, and Sarah filled their home with curtains she sewed and quilts she made. They raised chickens and bought a milk cow, and Ethan started breeding horses, discovering he had a way with the animals that reminded him how he'd been with horses as a boy before violence had hardened him. Life on the farm was peaceful but never boring. There were always chores to do, animals to tend, fences to mend. Ethan worked from sunrise to sunset, and every night he came home to Sarah, to her smile and her cooking and the way she fit perfectly in his arms. They talked for hours, sharing their days, their dreams, their fears. Ethan told her more about his past, about the guilt he carried for the lives he'd taken, and Sarah listened without judgment, helping him work through the darkness that sometimes still haunted him. "You can't change what you did," she told him one night as they lay in bed, her head on his chest. "But you can choose what you do from now on. You can choose to be kind, to help people, to build instead of destroy. That's what matters, Ethan, who you are now. I'm trying, he said, stroking her hair. Every day I'm trying to be worthy of you. You already are, she insisted, tilting her head up to kiss his jaw. You've always been worthy. You just needed to believe it. Their first winter together was harsh, with snow that piled up past the windows and temperatures that dropped so low the water in the trough froze solid every night. But inside their house, there was warmth and love. Ethan kept the fires burning, and Sarah cooked hearty stews and baked bread that filled the house with the most wonderful smells. They spent evenings reading by lamplight, or playing cards, or simply talking while the wind howled outside. It was during one of those cold February nights that Sarah told him she was expecting a baby. Ethan froze, the wood he'd been loading into the stove forgotten in his hands. "A baby," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, are you sure?" "I'm sure," she said, smiling at his stunned expression. "Dr. Henderson confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Ethan, in late summer." He dropped the wood and crossed to her in 2 steps, kneeling beside her chair and placing his hands gently on her still flat stomach. "A baby," he said again, and this time there was wonder in his voice and joy and a fear so profound it made him shake. "What if I'm not a good father? What if I don't know how? You'll learn," Sarah said, covering his hands with hers. "Just like you learned how to be gentle, how to love, how to build a life worth living. You'll be an amazing father, Ethan. I know it." The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Ethan built a cradle in the evenings, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, making sure there were no sharp edges that could hurt his child. Sarah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, and Martha Preston came over often to help and offer advice. Ethan became even more protective than before, insisting Sarah rest more, do less heavy work, let him handle things she'd normally do herself. "I'm pregnant, not fragile," she laughed one day when he tried to carry her over a puddle. "You're precious," he corrected, setting her down carefully on the other side. "You're carrying our child. Let me take care of you, Sarah, please." She softened at the plea in his voice, standing on her toes to kiss him. "All right, but you have to promise not to drive me crazy with worry." "I'll try," he said, though they both knew it was a promise he'd probably break. Their son was born on a hot August evening in 1879, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. Ethan held Sarah's hand through the whole labor, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement. And when Dr. Henderson placed the baby in his arms, wrapped in the soft blue blanket Sarah had made, Ethan wept openly. "He's perfect," he said, staring down at the tiny face, the small hands that gripped his finger with surprising strength. "Sarah, he's perfect." "What should we name him?" Sarah asked, exhausted but glowing with happiness. Ethan thought of his brother, the one he'd lost, the one whose death had set him on the path of violence. "James," he said softly. "Can we call him James?" "James Novak," Sarah said, testing the name. "It's perfect. Hello, James. Welcome to the world, little one." Fatherhood transformed Ethan in ways he couldn't have imagined. The gentleness Sarah had awakened in him when he'd seen her bleeding, the tenderness he'd discovered he was capable of, it all poured into his son. He was patient with James's crying, attentive to every need, and as the baby grew, Ethan was there for every milestone. First smile, first laugh, first time rolling over. He carried James in a sling Sarah made while he did chores, talking to him constantly, telling him about the horses and the chickens, and the way the Montana sky changed colors at sunset. "You're going to grow up knowing you're loved," Ethan told his son one evening, holding him against his chest while Sarah prepared dinner. You're going to grow up safe and happy, and you'll never have to know the kind of darkness I lived in. I promise you that, James. I promise." The years flowed by like water in the creek that ran through their property. James grew into a sturdy toddler, then a curious little boy who followed his father everywhere, chattering constantly and asking endless questions. Ethan taught him to be gentle with the animals, to respect the land, to treat everyone with kindness. When James was 3, Sarah gave birth to twin daughters, Emma and Alice, and their house filled with even more laughter and chaos. Ethan proved to be as gentle and patient with his daughters as he was with his son. He braided their hair in the mornings, read them stories at night, and carried them on his shoulders when they went walking in the fields. The ruthless bounty hunter was gone, replaced entirely by a loving husband and father who found his greatest joy in his family. Fort Benton grew and prospered over the years, and Ethan became a respected member of the community. People forgot about his violent past, or at least stopped holding it against him. He helped his neighbors when they needed it, served on the town council, and occasionally acted as a deputy when Marshal Garrett needed extra help. But he never killed again. He'd put that part of his life behind him forever. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Sarah on a picnic to the spot where he'd first bought land, the place where their house now stood. The children were staying with her parents for the day, giving them rare time alone. They sat on a blanket under a cottonwood tree, eating the lunch Sarah had packed, watching the clouds drift across the endless Montana sky. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked suddenly. "Giving up that life? The excitement, the danger, the reputation you had?" Ethan looked at her, this woman who had changed everything, who had saved him in ways that went far deeper than he'd saved her that day in the saloon. Her hair had threads of silver now, and there were lines around her eyes from years of smiling, and she was more beautiful to him than she'd been at 22. "Regret it," he repeated, pulling her close. "Sarah, you gave me a life worth living. You gave me love and family and peace. You gave me everything I didn't even know I needed. That day you stumbled into the saloon bleeding, when I saw you falling and something in me just broke open. That was the best moment of my life, because it led to all of this." "I was so scared that day," Sarah said, resting her head on his shoulder. "I thought I was going to die. But then you were there, and I looked into your eyes, and I wasn't scared anymore. I knew somehow that you would protect me, that I was safe with you." "You trusted me," Ethan said, kissing the top of her head. "When everyone else feared me, when I feared myself, you trusted me. You saw something in me worth saving." "I saw the man you really were," Sarah said, turning to look up at him. "The man you are, gentle and strong and full of love. That's who caught me when I fell, Ethan. Not the ruthless bounty hunter. The real you." They kissed as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, a kiss full of 10 years of love and devotion and partnership. Around them, their land stretched out green and fertile, marked by fences Ethan had built and fields Sarah had planted. In the distance, they could see the house where their children slept and played and grew, where they'd built a life together from nothing but hope and determination and love. "I want more years with you," Ethan said when they finally broke apart. 100 more years wouldn't be enough." "Then we'll have to make the most of the ones we get," Sarah said, smiling. "Every single day we'll choose each other and choose love and choose this life we've built." "Every single day," Ethan agreed, holding her close as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of joys and sorrows, challenges and triumphs. James grew into a fine young man who inherited his father's skill with horses and his mother's kind heart. The twins became beautiful, spirited young women who kept their parents on their toes with their adventures and dreams. Ethan and Sarah added to their land, eventually buying out a neighbor who moved east, expanding their horse breeding operation until Novak horses were known throughout Montana Territory for their quality and temperament. When Montana achieved statehood in 1889, Ethan and Sarah celebrated with their neighbors in Fort Benton, watching the fireworks over the Missouri River with their children. James was 17 then, already helping run the ranch, and the twins were 14, full of plans for their futures. Ethan stood with his arm around Sarah, feeling the weight of years and happiness and contentment settle over him like a warm blanket. "We've built a good life," Sarah said, echoing his thoughts as she so often did. "The best life," Ethan corrected. "All because of you, Sarah. All because you gave me a reason to be better." She turned in his arms, her green eyes still as bright and clear as they'd been that day in the saloon 21 years ago. "We saved each other," she said firmly. "I was bleeding and falling, and you caught me. But Ethan, you were bleeding too in ways people couldn't see, and I caught you. That's what love is, catching each other when we fall." Ethan kissed her as the fireworks exploded overhead, as their children cheered and laughed nearby as the town they'd made their home celebrated its future. He thought about the man he'd been, cold and ruthless and empty, and the man he'd become, gentle and loving and full. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every moment of struggle and doubt. The years of their middle age were peaceful and productive. They watched James court and marry a sweet girl from town, Hannah Miller, and welcomed their first grandchild, a boy they named Ethan George, into the world in 1892. Ethan held his grandson with the same tender care he'd shown his own children, marveling at the continuation of the life he and Sarah had created together. Emma married a banker and moved to Helena, while Alice surprised everyone by becoming a schoolteacher in Fort Benton, dedicated to educating the next generation of Montana children. Both daughters remained close to their parents, visiting often and bringing their own children when they came. The Novak Ranch became a gathering place for family, a center of love and laughter and belonging. As they aged, Ethan and Sarah spent more time on the porch of their house, watching the sun rise and set over the land they'd tended for decades. Their hair turned white, their steps grew slower, but their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, deeper, more essential with each passing year. "You remember the first thing I said to you?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat together watching the sunset, their hands intertwined as they always were. "Help me," Ethan said immediately. "And please." "And you did," Sarah said softly. "You helped me. You saved me, and I saved you right back." "The best thing I ever did was catching you when you fell," Ethan said, bringing her hand to his lips. "The best thing I ever did was letting you change me, letting you show me how to be gentle again." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky blazed with color. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life worth living, who had proved that even the hardest heart could soften with the right touch, the right love, the right moment of grace. When Ethan passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1903 at the age of 71, he died in the bed he'd built, in the house he'd constructed with his own hands, surrounded by the family he'd loved with all his heart. Sarah held his hand as he drew his last breath, whispering that she loved him, that she'd see him again, that she was grateful for every single day they'd had together. She followed him 6 months later, unable to bear being without the man who had become her whole world. Their children and grandchildren gathered for the funeral, telling stories about Ethan and Sarah's great love, about how they'd saved each other, about the legacy of kindness and gentleness and devotion they'd left behind. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking their ranch, under a cottonwood tree that Ethan had planted the year they were married. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates and a single line that James had chosen. They caught each other when they fell. The ranch passed to James and his family, who maintained it with the same love and care Ethan and Sarah had shown. The Novak name became synonymous with integrity and kindness in Fort Benton. And for generations, people told the story of the ruthless bounty hunter who'd fallen apart when he saw a woman bleeding, who'd become gentle in that single moment, who'd found redemption and love and everything worth living for in the arms of the woman he'd saved, and who had saved him right back. Their story became legend in Montana, passed down through the years as a testament to the power of love to transform even the hardest heart, to the possibility of redemption, to the truth that sometimes the most important thing we can do is catch someone when they fall and let them catch us in return. It was a story of the Old West, of violence and blood giving way to tenderness and growth, of two people who found each other at exactly the right moment and built something beautiful from the ashes of who they'd been. And in the house on the ranch that still stood strong more than a century later, in the faces of the descendants who still worked the land and raised horses and gathered for holidays, the love of Ethan and Sarah Novak lived on, a testament to the moment when a ruthless man saw a woman bleeding and discovered he still had the capacity for gentleness, for love, for everything that made life worth living.